Itlanadea. My given name is Tunchai Redvers, and my spirit name is Wabamigunokwe, or White Feather Woman. I am Dene and Métis from Treaty 8 in the Northwest Territories, and I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples that we are currently residing on. In October 2016, my brother and I started something called the We Matter campaign. The We Matter campaign is a national multimedia campaign which communicates with Indigenous youth who may be struggling that no matter how hard life gets, there is always a way forward. Within a month of launching this campaign, we reached over 1 million people through our social media feeds. Almost a year later, we have reached additional millions, have over 20,000 followers, and are now a full-time Indigenous and youth-led nonprofit committed to Indigenous youth empowerment, hope, and life promotion. We started this campaign because Indigenous youth experience the highest rates of addiction, abuse, violence, school dropouts, and suicide in Canada. In fact, Indigenous youth die by suicide at a rate 5 to 11 times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. This is a stark reality, and these statistics are incredibly problematic. But what is even more problematic is that Indigenous youth are the fastest growing population in Canada, meaning the current and upcoming generation of Indigenous children and youth will soon make up a large percentage of this country's population. If Canada's fastest growing demographic is also experiencing the highest rates of negative instances like suicide, then we are failing as a nation. So how do we change this? Well, we need to create a new environment, one where Indigenous youth live and succeed. And everybody is responsible for creating an environment where Indigenous youth live and succeed. So how do we do this? How do we all create an environment where Indigenous youth live and succeed? I'm going to share with you some ways that we can do this. But first, let's understand things a little bit more. You see, as an Indigenous youth growing up, I never quite understood why I saw and experienced the problems I did. I saw addiction, violence, and hopelessness in the communities and family I grew up in. And I've had my own run-ins with trauma, abuse, and suicidal ideation. It was only when I began to learn about the residential school that my grandmother grew up in did things begin to make sense. Through my own reflections, experiences, and work with We Matter, I came up with a way to visualize everything, using the metaphor of a house. Imagine I am standing inside of a house right now. Above and around me, there is the roof and foundation of the house. This structure is oppression and colonialism, which includes things like systemic racism, the Indian Act, the taking of Indigenous lands and the removal of Indigenous people from their lands, residential schools, dog slaughters, and the 60 Scoop, to name a few. Within this structure, in this house where I live, there's furniture, appliances, everyday things. Imagine these everyday things being a loss of culture and language, violence and lateral violence, mental health issues and illness, stereotypes, abuse, bullying, trauma, isolation, and a lack of public representation. These things are a direct result of this colonial structure. As a young person living inside of this house, I'm like a human sponge. I'm soaking in all of these things. I'm soaking in everything around me. But I also don't know how to get out of the house. I'm kind of locked in. As a young person, I have some pretty limited coping skills. I'm also trying to deal with all of the general challenges that go along with being an adolescent, such as school and managing relationships, And because I am Indigenous, there's a lack of support and resources, and especially culturally appropriate resources that are available to me. After soaking a lot of this in, I'm starting to feel pretty heavy, like a soaking wet sponge. I have just internalized everything, and I'm really lacking a sense of positive identity. I am now a young person who's feeling pretty lonely. I could be experiencing things like mental health, identity, self-esteem issues. I could be having feelings of shame, depression, a sense of hopelessness. And I'm turning to things like drugs, alcohol, self-harm, and suicide because I don't know what else to do. I've been at this state before, and it's a really hard place to be. And as a young person, a lot of the time I'm feeling and experiencing all of these things without understanding why. This has become my normal. I don't realize that there's this structure, this narrative, this environment that has created the ongoing context and reality in which I live. However, there is an alternate environment, one that is nurturing and supportive of Indigenous youth and is structured so that youth live and succeed. This decolonized structure includes things like affirmation and support, relatable role models, and the challenging of current norms. Public discourse and media does a really good job at affirming the negative, the hopelessness of Indigenous communities and youth. But what if we affirmed the positive? What if we fostered local and national narratives that focused more on the beauty and strengths of Indigenous communities and youth? What if instead of headlines like this, we saw more headlines like this? Supporting youth means centering youth needs and voices. Nobody knows what a person needs most, more than the person who needs it. Indigenous youth need to know that they are heard, that they are valued, that they are supported, and that they are loved. Growing up, I had a really hard time believing that Indigenous people could be successful. I had a hard time seeing positive role models that I could relate to. Musicians, actors, doctors, entrepreneurs, engineers, politicians. Indigenous youth need to know that there is hope for them to succeed and be connected to positive and healthy role models that they can connect to both personally and culturally. There are two norms that still exist today. One norm makes it really difficult to talk about complicated and taboo issues like mental health and abuse. Yet young people need to know that it's okay to talk about their experiences and struggles, because if a young person doesn't think that it's okay to talk about something, then they're not going to ask for help. The second norm favors, supports, and resources that are rooted in Western perspectives. But effective programming, mental health, and well-being resources for Indigenous youth need to be approached from an Indigenous perspective. Okay, so if we are all responsible for creating this environment, exactly what are some things that we can do to build it? Here are 3 things that you can do. Number 1, learn about and understand the historic and present contexts of Indigenous communities while acknowledging the hardships and barriers that Indigenous youth face today. This means actively seeking out Indigenous authors, academics, journalists, artists, and media. There are tons of resources and Indigenous-created content out there, from poetry to novels to music to movies to podcasts to magazines, that all speak to authentic experiences, both past and present. Even better, visit physical places. Visit a nearby First Nation, a friendship center, or tour an old residential school. Number 2, actively honor Indigenous and youth strengths. This means directly asking youth what they need, giving them a space at decision-making tables, at round tables, promoting youth-led initiatives. Invite them into boardrooms. Show up for them at their events, at their suicide awareness and water walks, and ask them what you can do for them. Engage with Indigenous youth and promote positive media and representation. Don't just scroll through, click, and share posts and articles that talk about overdose, death, and suicide. Rather than perpetuating stereotypes and hopelessness, find and share articles that promote positivity. If you're in media or reporting, then interview youth. Report on the hopeful things. Amplify the strengths and successes, the tribe called Reds, the university graduates, the people who create We Matter videos. What you choose to engage with, talk about, and share has a ripple effect. Number 3, support the indigenization of youth programs and resources. Invest in supports and resources that are specific to context and identity. Specifically, programs and resources that are rooted in tradition, land, language, and culture. Invest in mentorship programs. Work with Indigenous groups to create Indigenous-specific mental health content. Review your funding models to ensure that they are culturally and youth accessible. Donate to community projects and groups. Prioritize Indigenous and youth-led projects. And write to local MPs and national leaders about the importance of supporting Indigenous-led and rooted action. Write those letters and speak up. More importantly, accept Indigenous and youth knowledge as expert knowledge. Hold those voices up. These are all things that can be done. These are all things that you can do. Now imagine that I am a young person standing inside of a house. Above and around me, there is the roof and foundation of the house. Within this house, there are things like resilience, pride, positivity, love, truthfulness, strength, culture and language, hope, representation, unity, confidence, coping, and opportunity. Like a human sponge, I am soaking in all of these things. This is my reality. This is my normal. As individuals, as families, as communities, as a nation, we all play a role in creating environments. We can choose to perpetuate a negative and toxic environment that exists for Indigenous youth, or we can build a new environment that honors and supports Indigenous youth and sees them live and succeed. So which structure, which narrative, which environment do you want to be responsible for creating? Marcy Cho, thank you.